We couldn't have asked for a better person to come and speak to us about election integrity and fair elections. She's been the deputy election chair for Montgomery County for the last 9 years, and also serves as the secretary of the board of advisors to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission.
I'm really excited to do this today. As Rebecca was mentioning, I've been in a variety of different roles in the election policy arena, in election administration, over more than 20 years now. And I am currently serving as part of the professional staff of the Montgomery County Board of Elections here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Rebecca asked me to speak to you about myths and facts of the election process, election integrity. And what I'd really like to do is that I'm sure every one of you has some questions about the process, some things that you've heard, you'd like to know if they're true, you'd like to know if they're not true. You have questions. And what I really would encourage you to go ahead and enter those questions into the chat now, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off speaking in some generalities. I want to cover some general themes. I want to talk about the way that elections are administered around the country. And then we can kind of take it local for you. I don't know how many of you are sort of born and bred in Maryland, how many of you are originally, from this country or from another country, from another state, somewhere here. And so really election processes vary tremendously. And so a lot of the details that I can talk to you about, and we can kind of get into the weeds of how we do things here in Montgomery County, are going to be very different if you talk to someone who administers elections in Illinois or in California or in Texas or Georgia or Florida or Massachusetts or in another country somewhere in the world. And so what I'd like to sort of talk about first is I want you to think of election laws and processes as something that is really conducted within the local ecosystem of wherever you live. And a lot of the differences in our history, the differences in our governmental structure, a lot of the things that make a community are also reflected in the way that our elections are administered in that local jurisdiction or that state. And within that ecosystem, the election process itself is organic. It changes, it grows. And there are a number of different players who will nudge the process in one direction or another. There are institutions and there are stakeholders where you'll see more of an emphasis on voting by mail or more of an emphasis on voting in person, different changes in the local laws as they have evolved over time. And so I really like to talk about that process as a very organic one. At the same time, as with really any other aspect of public policy, there are these tensions between the local level, the state level, the federal level. And so you have those who really want to customize the election process around the local community and around sort of where the government that is closest to the people at the local, the county, the municipal level. But then you also have variety of reasons why people want to see more of a uniform process across the state or more of a uniform process nationally. And this is really, I think, a very healthy and a very creative tension that we have. And what it results in is sort of this marble cake of federalism and of the different tensions and interests that we have in how our democracy is administered, how our process is run. And I think that is a very healthy aspect of our structure. And it means that things change and they're changing constantly. So when we talk about elections and we talk about them either here in Montgomery County, we talk about them nationally, there's a couple of essential features that you will find wherever you look, because these are things that we as election officials hold very near and dear to our hearts. They are sort of central to the principles of what we do for a living. And the first is one person, one vote. That bedrock principle, we have a whole lot of different specific ways that we guarantee that, or that we build our structures to ensure that and to monitor for that. But fundamentally, whether you vote when the voter who walks into that voting booth, or the voter who puts their ballot in the mail, or the voter who, uses a drop box to cast their ballot, our structures are all kind of individually customized and built in order to ensure that we maintain that relationship of one voter to one vote. Well, the only way we can do that is if we keep track of who votes, and if we keep track of the ballots that we count and where they came from. And so you're going to find, essential to our processes, some form of a list of voters, of those who were eligible to vote or who have voted. And you're going to find some form of that cross-check against those who voted and the ballots that were cast and that were counted. And any number of sort of different ways where in the polling place we manage that, both the integrity of that process to make sure that the numbers match, and where we ensure the privacy of that process so that we are unable at the end of the day to trace your vote to you. We know you voted, we know where you voted, we know when you voted, we don't know how you voted. And so that is really a fundamental feature of the way that our elections are managed in this country. The second fundamental process that I want to speak to is transparency. And I lump transparency together with impartiality, because you can know me, you can trust me. I can sit here and tell you, oh, I'm an unaffiliated voter. I, am not here to work for one candidate or one political party or another. And we have a variety of ethics laws that, watch for those things. But at the end of the day, I don't want you to trust me. I want you to verify my work. And so we have laws and processes, legal processes designed for you to be able to do that. We also have laws and processes to structure that. So if we have a close, controversial election that's down to one vote, can we have a mob scene in our office? No, we have a process where we have certain individuals, we have candidates, we have the political parties, we have people who serve as election judges, who are sort of proxies for the general public in having the closest relationship to the process and the closest access. And then we also have the various ways in which we have reporting, we have data, we have, whether it's cameras on the process or, the reports that we release and the certain kinds of duties that we can only do in a public session, or that we can only do, in a room where the public is able to access. And so that's kind of a second fundamental feature: one person, one vote, transparency, and impartiality. A third fundamental feature, I think, certainly to our American system of government is self-government, is that we have a participatory democracy. And our processes are really geared around, you don't just entrust me with your vote, you volunteer, your friends and neighbors volunteer. You entrust those of your friends and neighbors who volunteer to be a part of the process and to actually administer the vote, to actually count the ballots and check in the voters in the polling place. I like to say that serving as a poll worker, or an election judge, as we call them in Maryland, is really the original election protection. That being a part of the process itself is institutionally how our system of government allows for making sure that the vote is fair and is participatory. It's, like jury duty in a sense, just like we have laws that provide for certain kinds of cases to be tried before a jury of your peers. We also have laws that provide for certain election processes to be conducted by election officials, by sworn officials who are your peers in the community. And then another central theme that drives a lot of what I would say the bureaucratic structure of what we do and the rigor of the election calendar is finality. Is it an orderly transfer of power with regularly scheduled elections? Fundamentally means that the process moves fast and the process has a rigor to it. It has deadlines that are meaningful. It has all-nighters being pulled here in my office so that we get all the work done when all the work needs to get done. and that we have legal deadlines for people to do things like file contests and for things like audits and legal processes to be conducted to question the outcome of an election. And then the combatants in the arena dust themselves off and gear up next campaign. And that's, that calendar is really an important element to the way that our system is designed, the way that our system keeps itself going and makes sure that we never have the orderly transfer of power always happens. And it always happens in a way that the process is really designed to support and to ensure. So my role and the role of my counterparts across the country in whatever form or structure it takes. In some places here, we have a board of elections. I mentioned that we have a board, which is made up of representatives of the two major political parties. And I am on the nonpartisan staff, the county merit system staff of the Board of Elections that conducts that election. But in other parts of the country, you might have a county clerk who's elected, or you might have some other form of government structure, and then different protections and balances, checks and balances that are designed around that. Our role is really to serve as a volunteer coordinator. Our role is to serve as an event planner. Our role is to serve as a referee. We organize the materials, we train the workers, we procure the supplies and the equipment. We really operate kind of as the glue that holds our participatory democracy together, and keeps the process on track.
Well, maybe since you're talking kind of big picture now, there are some big picture questions. And the last one that came through is about gerrymandering. With the question about how severe gerrymandering actually is, what can be done to undo gerrymandering. If you could talk a little bit about that, that would be awesome.
My short answer to that is that one person's gerrymandering is another person's way of ensuring that we do have a responsive and accountable government, and that our representatives are representing communities of interest. And so we have had a variety of laws passed over the years. We have a variety of different perspectives, interest groups, judicial rulings that are designed to sort of ensure the fairness of the process and to kind of set out what the ground rules are and to keep those districts accountable, or keep those who make the districts accountable. It's really one of those things that is going to vary so tremendously across the country, that I think the key thing that I would like to point out in talking about that question is that process too is designed to be participatory. Now we have different ways in which the after every decennial census, we have congressional redistricting that occurs, and then we also have redistricting for other districts that we have in Maryland. Of course, we have our legislative districts, we have our Board of Education districts, we have our county council districts. Those who draw the lines are accountable in one way, shape, or form to the people themselves, whether that is because they are on the ballot, or through the mechanisms that their laws are written. And so right now you have any number of public hearings that are currently being held for voters to participate directly and draw attention to concerns, to the draft maps that have been released of where some of these district lines may be. You might have one witness who says, this line doesn't make any sense. You're dividing a community in a way that I'm not happy with. And you might have another witness who says, thank you for finally bringing together a community that I identify with. And so there's really a lot of complexity to it. And the best way to be engaged is to be engaged and to monitor it and speak up, speak out, testify.
I think that's really helpful because it is a complex issue and it gets down into boilerplate, right? This is like the message. And sometimes we don't remember that how complex it is. Another one of the questions that was up here that I think might be similar in that it has to do with what you were talking about in terms of the election process not being standardized, right? You talked about the marble cake and how different it is. Do you think are there any dangers that we're facing? I mean, that is one of the issues that's in the news these days, is that we're trying to get voter rights legislation passed to try to standardize some of the at least election access, but that goes against the idea that states have their own rights. So it's a funny kind of line to draw, but I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that as part of the tension.
Sure. There's I was going to say two, but there's really at least two, more than two, different kinds of conversations you can have on these topics, depending on who your speakers are, right? So if you had someone here speaking to you from an interest group that has a particular perspective, they would discuss the same issues in one way and through the lens of, that perspective.
Right.
If you have a public official, they'll, probably talk about specific legislation or laws that they're trying to change to address some aspect of that. With me, you're talking to the bureaucrat. You're talking to the person who administers the machinery of that process. And so when I look at a piece of legislation, whether that's federal, whether that's state, whether that's a policy solution here at the county level that's being looked at, I'm going to look at it through the lens of how's it going to work? And so regardless of whether the policy choices being presented are liberal or conservative or are federal or are local, my job is to administer what passes. And my job is to administer that through a lens of impartiality and uniformity. And so, and that's what I do. As I've looked at a variety of different versions of the federal legislation that's been under consideration. And here in my office, we do that every legislative session as well with the state laws that come up. But the kinds of questions we're going to ask are going to be about, if you want to do that, then let's talk about the way the databases are going to have to be designed in order for us to accomplish it. Or let's talk about the calendar of the processes. Well, that's probably going to mean we're going to have more provisional ballots, so we're going to need more time to count them, or whatever that process is. And so that's my general answer, is that we have such a rich process with so many different stakeholders. My job is to make sure that whatever those laws are, we administer them fairly and efficiently.
And so the other question is actually a machinery question. So maybe it is like right up your alley here, but it's also related to the standardized versus states' individual processes. The question is whether do all elections have paper ballots that can be counted if we need a recount?
No.
Okay.
Here in Maryland, they do. Here in Montgomery County, they do. Over time, we've seen an evolution of the way that that voting has been conducted. And there's actually a really fascinating history when you go back through the ways that elections have been conducted over the years and the different designs of ballot boxes and designs of ballots and different ways that the machinery has evolved to catch fraud or to ensure fairness or transparency or privacy. We had certainly most recently in the memory of students that would be here at Montgomery College, we had about 20 years ago, we had a big wave of reforms where what we had seen happen was that in response to paper ballots and some of the challenges that some kinds of voters experienced with paper ballots and with punch card ballots and with some of the technology that was prevalent at the time, we saw a reaction toward more electronic systems, more touch screens, more systems that allowed for audio capabilities and that allowed for equivalent access for individuals with disabilities as well as for all other voters. And so we had kind of a a wave of implementing a certain generation of what we call direct recording electronic voting equipment. And then about 7 or 8, 10 years later, we had kind of a pushback, and we kind of went in the opposite direction. We had a lot of work put into trying to go to durable paper systems where you address the concerns that were then prevailing about, well, what if somebody hacked into the systems, and how would we address that? We had paper trails that people wanted to generate as individuals were casting their ballot. And so now we're kind of more in an era where the paper is predominant. What we use here is what is used in a lot of other areas of the country, where we have a paper ballot that is digitally scanned. And so we maintain effectively a PDF image of that ballot, as well as the physical ballot itself, so that we have kind of that check between the two different documents, as it were. And one of the features, as far as that marble cake that we were talking about, of the way these processes are designed, is that over the course of these last 20 years, what we've had is a strengthening of federal standards and federal certification of voting equipment, while at the same time, we have also had local officials and state officials who have taken a greater interest in the machinery of the process and making sure that we have the paper trail, the records that can withstand scrutiny and withstand audits, as well as having the equipment be tested and functioning, publicly tested and certified to federal standards as well.
That's great. So there actually is there are two other questions by the same person is asking them, but I think they're really different. First one is related to what you were just saying, so I'll start with that. And it's a comment that mail-in ballots could not be scanned recently, and wondering if that has been corrected.
A comment that mail-in ballots could not be scanned recently. I'm not sure what that question is referring to.
Okay.
But I'm gonna take a stab at it. I'm gonna guess, because I do think that there's an interesting story to be told, and something that question might be geared towards. I spoke a little earlier about the challenges in the history of how technology evolves and how we maintain access for all different kinds of voters. And one of the communities of voters that often faces real challenges in voting is overseas voters, whether that's voters who are in the military or civilian overseas voters, simply because of the time it takes for them to get their ballot and for them to get their ballot sent back to them. And the other side of that tension is, you'll have some who would like to see a more electronic process, more of like an online voting kind of experience. And you have some who say, no, the technology can't support that. We need to make sure that these processes are paper processes. And so the solution that the state of Maryland set upon, to even a greater scale than other states, is that we will send a voter their ballot electronically, but they have to send it back to us on paper. We don't accept a voted ballot back electronically as an email attachment or a fax, or that has to be sent back to us with a stamp, effectively, or in a FedEx envelope. So we can do things in order to accelerate getting that ballot to the voter, but we're still subject to the challenges of getting a document back to us from overseas. And so the technology that we have settled upon allows for voters, who might be in another country, to print their ballot. Well, who knows what kind of paper they're putting that ballot on, right? Who knows what kind of envelope they're putting it in? And so we have different sizes and shapes of paper and of envelopes and dissimilar documents that come back to our office, and we need to treat them all in a uniform manner in terms of counting them. Now, because of the rigor of those federal certification standards that I was talking about, because of the rigors of making sure that our procurement process follows and the manufacture of voting equipment follows federal standards, we don't have a way to just take them and scan them. In order for us to count the ballot of someone who prints their ballot off from home, which we don't only limit that to overseas voters, by the way, or voters with disabilities, literally any voter in the entire state of Maryland can choose to vote that way if they wish. When that comes back to our office, we have a bipartisan team of people, of election judges, of poll workers, sit down as a pair and hand duplicate that ballot from the original 8.5 by 11, maybe yellow sheet of paper that they printed out of their home computer, and duplicate it onto the card stock of a ballot, like what we would have given that voter in the polling place. That's all done in a great big room that is open to public inspection. Here in the last election, we did that at the Plumgar Recreation Center, and we had observers sitting in the bleachers watching us as voters, as election judges hand copied all of those ballots. And that has been at times up to a third of the absentee ballots that we count here in our county. It was a smaller percentage in this last election because we had so many voters who had their ballot mailed to them. We had fewer who took advantage of that print from home option. But I think it's a good example of, the ways in which technology doesn't always meet our needs, but we find a way. And we find a way in a way that ensures access and transparency and impartiality. And no, those ballots cannot be directly scanned, but we find a way to make sure that the vote can be.
That's incredible. I have another question related to the hand counting. There's been a lot in the news about the audits going on in Arizona and maybe some other states as well. And I'm just wondering how common it is, or if Maryland has had recounts of elections on a regular basis. Is this something unusual?
It's pretty unusual. We do have a recount law that allows for if a losing candidate wants to ask for a recount, they can. If it is close enough, we'll pay for it. The taxpayers will pay for it. If it's not close enough, then that losing candidate will pay for it. We'll pay for the costs of conducting the recount. And that includes if the recount is conducted and it does in fact find a problem, if it finds that there was a sizable change, then you'll see the machinery of the process kick in, and the taxpayers will pick up the check on that recount process. We had a recount after the primary election in 2018. We actually had two. We had a recount in a legislative district contest. And then we had a closely contested county executive race. And so in both of those cases, we had one where we conducted a full hand recount for the legislative district contest. And then the candidate who requested the recount selected certain precincts that they wanted to have recounted. And they sent their observers, and we had bipartisan teams of election judges physically counting batches of ballots by hand, sorting them into stacks of ballots that were for one candidate or another. And ultimately, the candidates were satisfied with the outcome of those recounts, and then we certified those results.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I don't know if you wanted to kind of shift to elections in our state or our county. If there's anything that you'd like, can you share with us about what's going on in our own home territory?
What's going on in our own home territory? I think what I'd like really everyone who votes here to know, and in many cases this is reflective of the national narrative of what's going on around the country as well, is that because of the circumstances of the pandemic and the 2020 general election, and because we had such a shift in emphasis, because we had, and the machinery of the process was different across the country, but fundamentally we had the same thing play out, where we had a massive shift away from voters showing up in the close quarters of a polling place toward voters casting their ballot from home by mail primarily. And that certainly played out here in Montgomery County. We had drop boxes that we installed. We had a drop box installed on the grounds of every early voting site in the county. We had a drop box installed at every high school. We ultimately had 54 drop boxes across the county where any voter was able to take their ballot. We also had, of course, every blue post office box on every neighborhood corner was a ballot drop box as well, because thanks to a state law, we have prepaid postage on every ballot envelope, every return ballot envelope as well. So voters can truly use a mailbox as their drop box for their post office too, for their ballot as well. That was a massive shift. It was not something that voters had really done in great numbers before. In fact, on Super Tuesday in the 2020, in advance of the 2020 election, I had the opportunity to speak as part of a panel. And I was on Capitol Hill. I was sitting in one of the House office buildings giving a presentation. And I was sitting there with a county clerk from Arizona and a county clerk from Missouri, and both states that are out west. And, the county clerk from Arizona was talking extensively about their vote by mail process. And I sat there, Super Tuesday, spring of 2020, and said, I am your local election official here on the East Coast. We don't vote by mail on the East Coast. We don't have that same kind of relationship with our government. We like to vote in person. Within 2 weeks, we had a new process, and we were going to be voting entirely by mail for that election that was going to be conducted just a few months later, because the circumstances really dictated it. Circumstances changed, and so the political norms needed to shift as well. So now here we are in a situation where we had the overwhelming majority of our voters cast a ballot by mail in the last 2 elections. But that was a temporary thing. That was on the basis of emergency authority that the governor had to address the pandemic circumstances. That didn't change our laws permanently. And in the 2021 legislative session, the General Assembly did not change our laws permanently, nor do I expect them to in the upcoming 2022 General Assembly. And so the underlying structure of how we conduct our elections is still designed around an assumption that most people are going to go to their neighborhood polling place. And on election day in person, that's your only option. If you vote in person, is to go to your assigned local polling place in your community. Voters will not have the option to just go to any high school like they did in the last election. I do expect that to be confusing for many people. I do expect many people, especially if they voted for the very first time in the last general election, to just assume that they can go to their nearest high school. And so what we are, now we will have early voting, and we will have an expansion of early voting. We'll have more early voting sites than we had in 2018. We're still going to have the drop boxes that we're going to have throughout the community. We're still going to have the option for voters to request that ballot, and we're going to mail an absentee ballot request form or a mail-in ballot request form to every voter. And so a lot of those essential features, we're going to make those options available for the voter. But there are some things about the way that the process was designed prior to the pandemic that are returning, in particular, the in-person voting options on election day. And so we're going to be sending sample ballot, official voter information out to households. We're going to be certainly doing, outreach and media of all kinds in order to get the word out. Those are the kinds of things that I think that students and people who are engaged in things like a university community can really help us magnify that message and get the word out to voters about what voting options are really going to look like in 2022, which will be so different than in 2020. And that's really the same dynamic is going on around the country with different variations, certainly based on the local laws and rules and political structure.
That's great. And can you say something? I think one of the other things that I know we have in Maryland, we'll have the same day registration where you can vote and get registered on the same day. How would someone who is not registered get themselves registered to vote on the same day they're voting?
We always try to encourage voters not to rely on same day registration. That's kind of a fallback. That's not the ideal. The ideal scenario, we have, it used to be that our voter registration deadline was 21 days before an election. There are still certain kinds of things that we can't do to a voter record after that deadline. It still exists in law. And so there's a limited number of ways that there's a limited number of transactions that can be done in this same day registration method. And so we really, we always advise people to really check their voter registration now. In fact, anyone in Montgomery County or anywhere in the state of Maryland can text check, CHECK, to 77788. And when you text check to 77788, what comes back to is actually the URL to click on for a link to look up your own voter registration. If you are currently a registered voter, you can enter in your information and check and see what address we have on file for you, where your polling place is, what political party we have you registered with, in order to make sure if you've moved, if you need to update something, to do that so that the rolls are clean, so that we have an accurate voter registration list going into the election season. I mentioned that 21-day deadline. There's two key things that I want voters to understand about same-day registration. And the first is that it does require proof of residency. And sometimes that can trip people up, because especially if they're newcomers to the area, maybe they don't have a utility bill in their name, or they haven't gone and gotten a driver's license with their address on it yet, or they have an old address on their driver's license. There's a number of different documents that can be used for proof of residency, but it is required for same-day registration. In many cases, the voter who does a same-day registration ends up having to cast a provisional ballot, which we will count, provided that we have all of the information and it all checks out. But that's often a jarring and uncomfortable experience for voters to have to rely on a provisional ballot. And the third thing that trips people up is that if you are currently a registered voter, because of the insistence of the political parties in our state and how this process works, you can't change it within 21 days of an election. So if you're currently registered with a political party, or you're an unaffiliated voter who's not registered with a political party at all, if you walk into a polling place and try to vote in a different political party than the one that you're already registered in, you'll get a provisional ballot. But once we verify that you were not already registered with that political party 3 weeks prior, we're not going to be able to count that ballot, because it was not for a political party contest that you were eligible to vote in. Now that's not the same everywhere across the country. This is one of those things that varies. We have what the term of art for it is that we have a closed primary, where there are other places in the country that have what they call an open primary, where people can change their political party on election day, but that's not the law in the state of Maryland. And so, for those reasons that I just described, we really try to ask that everyone, don't procrastinate on this one. If you can register in advance, don't rely on same-day registration, and take care of it up front.
And when you say unaffiliated, is that the same as someone who's registered independent?
We don't use the word independent, because we have had various political parties that have formed over time in our history that have used the word independent. And so in order to keep things the notion is that we're keeping things less confusing. In order to keep it less confusing and not think that you're trying to affiliate with a political party that uses the word independent, our official legal term is unaffiliated, to reflect that you're not affiliated with a political party at all.
So there are a couple of other questions. We may just have enough questions to take us through, because I want to make sure that these get answered. But I think this is a good one. One is, what is your assessment of some of the voting laws that have passed in Georgia and Texas?
I think the key takeaway for I mentioned at the top of our discussion that really voting laws and procedures vary across the country. And one of the things that is challenging about, certainly everyone has their own, perspectives and, attitudes on certain elements of this process. I think one of the things that I like to point out anytime I get into a discussion, particularly about really hot button stuff, where people get really, worried about what's going on in other areas of the country, is only believe about 30% of what you read. Because some of what you're reading about is these are real issues that people are grappling with. But there's also a lot of narrative built around those laws and processes that are maybe not the whole picture. And I think two examples that I will give of like seriously hot button stuff that I don't want people to think of these issues only through the prism of, oh, what's going on in Georgia? Oh, what's going on in Texas? Oh, what's going on in whichever state we're like hearing people talk about on the news tonight. Is that where you see the real friction and the real fights over things they're often things that we all struggle with. And so, for example, there was a whole lot of attention paid to the discussion of voters being given food and drink while they're in line. The question of what someone can give to a voter while they're waiting in line to cast their ballot is fraught everywhere. It's not only fraught, in a red state or the blue state or, wherever. We all have some kind of laws that restrict that restrict people from being able to mob the voter and, kind of impede their access to the polling place. And so this is not an issue that is, on the national news in Montgomery County, Maryland, but in Montgomery County, Maryland, we have what we call our electioneering boundary. And outside of that boundary, anybody can hand out anything they want to effectively. But inside that boundary, you can't. People cannot be inside that area without, there's really strict rules about exit polling is allowed to be conducted inside that boundary, but only on the basis of having gotten a letter that comes from the state administrator of elections that says this is a legit exit pollster that is allowed, to do this under this particular law. And so, that's one of the things that I first started asking when I heard that there was this controversy in Georgia. I'm like, well, what exactly is their law? What's their boundary? What are people allowed to do? What are people not allowed to do? The detail kind of gets obscured. And then there was another discussion I was hearing about the whose call it is, whether we use ballot drop boxes. Is a local jurisdiction allowed to put as many ballot drop boxes out there as they want? Or does the state have the authority to tell the local jurisdiction how many ballot drop boxes they're allowed to have? Again, not really a controversy here in Montgomery County, Maryland right now, but it's also an open question here, right? If Montgomery County decides we want to have 54 ballot drop boxes, well, what if, another county doesn't want to have the same number of drop boxes or doesn't have the money to pay for the same number of drop boxes? And what's a fair formula? To what extent should a local jurisdiction be allowed to provide, more days of voting, more locations of voting, more hours of voting, more ballot drop boxes than another? Is that fair? Is that fair to the voters living in these different areas? And so, the details are often, they're fascinating and people dig in on their perspectives. And I do not in any way want to suggest that the details don't matter and don't matter really deeply to real people. They do, they matter a lot. But the nuance is important everywhere, not just in Georgia and not just in Texas and, not just in any one jurisdiction anywhere in the country.
Right. And the same vein, there's a question that just came up about the protection of election poll workers, as long as we're hanging out at the polls here and thinking about that. Do you can you say anything about what kinds of protection they should be getting, or I'm throwing that open to you.
Yeah, that's I think that is one of the issues that I do expect our legislature to take up in this upcoming legislative session, because I think that we have really been fortunate here in our area that we have not had the same extent of the sort of really personal, anger that has been directed at the process that we've had in some of the places that have been more in focus on the national news in particular. Now, that's not to say that we didn't receive it. We definitely had some phone calls that came into our office and had some threats, and we absolutely have had some election judges who have been on the receiving end of some really ugly behavior. That's not totally new. There was a different flavor to that in this last election. You know, tensions were really running high. But it's also, I'm unfortunately, I have to say that we've seen this before too. We've had controversies, we've had things get personal, we've had situations where an authority figure, you know, at a polling place is seen as someone to really vent one's anger toward. Now, what we do, and this is among the procedures that we have for our election judges when they're in the polling place, you know, we always tell them in a true emergency, call 911 first, then call us. And the police are out in the community, or are in plain clothes and uniformed, and are circulating, you know, throughout the county, and are aware of where every single polling place is. And, you know, they have maps, they have all of the information they need in order to see, you know, what room in any building we're in. You know, we have needed to really, you know, place an emphasis on making sure that we equip people, you know, to protect themselves and to call in, you know, assistance where needed. If you have an angry member of the community, you know, if you have an unpleasant situation that arises in a polling place. But I do think that we also, because it is a national narrative, I think there's going to be some discussions about that in the legislative session this upcoming year, you know, to make sure that the legal protections are in place where they need to be, so that we can really protect those who volunteer, protect those who serve.
That's really, really important. And I think it harks back to what you're talking about, the participatory nature, right? I mean, that's where, if you have a strong feeling about this, that the citizens can get involved in advocating for different legislative initiatives around that. That's great. Okay, so here's a nitty gritty question, and then I kind of want to ask him a lighter question as we go off into the evening. The question is about how elections are funded. Is it like, how much of that is funded by our taxes, or by federal government? Can you kind of enlighten us on that?
Elections are entirely taxpayer funded. In Montgomery County, Maryland, we do not receive a single dime of federal money or a single dime of state money to administer our elections. Our salaries, our building, the lights in the room where I'm sitting are all funded by the taxpayers of Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, that's not to say that there are not also expenditures at the federal and state level. They're not grants. They're not direct money that is given to the county level to do the things that we do. Montgomery County, Maryland has approximately an $8 million budget on an annual basis for conducting the elections here in the county, at you know, in a county of over 1 million people. And a lot of that, by the way, goes to support the year-round processes of voter registration, not just the event of Election Day, of course, or of early voting, but we have that year-round, the transaction of really databases where we are following every transaction that someone makes at the Motor Vehicle Administration. About 10% of voters move every year. And we have a lot of year-round work that occurs, especially on the voter registration side. But that is all funded at the county level. There are certain expenditures that the state of Maryland makes. And one of them, a key thing that the state of Maryland does do, is they procure and they choose the voting equipment that we use statewide, and they pick up half the tab. So whatever statewide system the state chooses, half of it is paid by the state, half of it is paid by the county. And there's a shared burden there, but they don't pay us to pay the bill. They pay their share of what they mandate, and then the county pays for the rest. And there are, you know, some federal dollars that come from time to time, but the amount of federal money that is spent is really a drop in the bucket as far as the actual costs of administering elections nationwide. And those funds have been targeted to some very specific things. They've been used in some cases to purchase voting equipment. They've been used to do things like add layers of security to our voter registration databases, to do certain things, to really sort of protect the process, especially at the state level, though. That's not, for the very first time ever, to my knowledge, we did have a set of grants, independent grants that were given out to jurisdictions across the country in this last election. Because we had all of these additional expenditures for, things like personal protective equipment, the plexiglass shields that we were, setting up in locations. And we paid hazard pay to our poll workers. We paid an additional amount of the stipend to our poll workers. And those were things that actually here in our jurisdiction, we were able to defray by taking some of these outside expenditures to pay for those things. They were not for like salaries and equipment in our office, but for some of those add-on costs that were associated with the pandemic.
I think that was such a good question. It really does kind of get to the root of some of the others. I mean, the person who has is paying for it generally has some sense that they are the ones who make the decisions about how things run. So it sounds complicated and really interesting. That's great. Well, I'm debating now because I actually want to ask you what we as voters can do to influence some of the legislation that's coming up. You've talked a little bit about what we can anticipate when we go to the polls. But what would you recommend for someone who is interested in learning more and then possibly changing the legislation?
Right now, we have legislators in a posture where they're really kind of writing and preparing their legislation that they're thinking about pursuing in the upcoming legislative session. And so the interest groups, so organizations that are active historically in elections issues will certainly be talking to those legislators. And so a good sort of entry point for people who have an individual interest in these laws and these processes at this season of the year is to talk to your state delegate, talk to your state senator, talk to any interest groups, any organizations that you are affiliated with or a part of that are involved in these issues. Once we get into the legislative session, then there will be, you can always go onto the General Assembly website and search legislation. There's a drop down for topic areas and there's one for elections laws. And you can see when the bills are coming up and when they're scheduled for hearing. Anyone can testify, can sign up to testify in the legislature on their personal views as well as any organization that they may represent. Now, generally speaking, in an election year, you'll see people like me asking legislators to take a light pen at this time of the year, that we don't bureaucratically, procedurally, it presents risks to a process when you try to make big changes to it when it's underway. And so, you don't want to be changing the wheels on the bus while it's driving down the street. And so when you'll typically see bigger changes in the laws in the state of Maryland is in those odd numbered years. And where it'll be right after a major election and people will have whatever they want to change about the process while it's fresh. In the even numbered years, you'll tend to see smaller bills, more tweaks, less of major changes being enacted, although they may be discussed, they may be considered, they may be testified on.
Well, I think one of the takeaways that for me, at least, in listening to you, is that it is more complicated than the headlines that we hear on the news. So I think I feel really empowered because I kind of know, how to do things, but it also seems like it's really important to understand what it is that you're asking for and to understand the context of it. So that to me is like super, super important. We have just 2 minutes, but I wonder if you can tell us how you got involved in this field. I mean, what drove you to be interested in elections and voting?
Well, we live and work in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And so like many people who live and work in this area, I was drawn to the nation's capital. I was drawn to being involved in these issues from a federal policy perspective early in my career. And I worked for some national organizations doing policy work. And November 2000, as we were all riveted to the television, watching what had occurred in Florida in the 2000 election, my boss at the time at the organization that I was working at pointed at me and said, I need you to go learn elections. This is going to be a really big issue. So, I started to learn, and somewhere in there, I called up the director of the Montgomery County Board of Elections, where I lived, and said, hey, can I come hang out and see the process and see how this works? And I worked for the National Conference of State Legislatures for several years. I worked for the National Association of Counties for several years. I advocated on behalf of election officials in Washington, D.C. And then 11 years ago, I took a job on a dare working for the DC Board of Elections. I had the election official there at the time I was working with, and he said, you want to know how this really works? So I took a job in Washington, DC, actually on a dare from the election official there that I was working with at the time. He said, if you want to know how this really works, how elections are really won, come serve with me in the trenches, come work with me. And let's do this. We were implementing some changes at the time at the District of Columbia. And so I worked there for a couple of years. And then we had someone who had been a mentor to me, worked here at the Montgomery County Board of Elections and was retiring. And I was able to apply for and get her job here at the Montgomery County Board of Elections, and have had the pleasure of serving the community here where I live and where my kids go to school now for 9 years.
Thank you very, very much. This has been really, really enlightening. And I think we have all learned a lot.
My
Thanks
closing
very much.
pitch, text SERVE, SERVE to 77788, SERVE to 77788. That will get you to the application to serve as an election judge, serve at the polls on election day or during early voting.